The piece of paper was worth $112. Leanne held it in her hand, the edges softened and frayed from a journey that had crossed half a territory. It was the only thing of value she had left, and it was not an asset but a burden. The ink, faded by sun and handling, detailed a debt incurred by her late husband, Wei, a debt she had come to settle in the only way she could. The man to whom it was owed lived here, in a small, weathered cabin at the end of a long, dusty track, with nothing but Wyoming sky and rolling plains for neighbors. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage of bone. She had practiced the words in her head 1,000 times, rehearsing them in the back of a jolting freight wagon and whispering them to herself during cold nights spent in strangers' barns. Now, standing before the rough-hewn door, the words felt like dust in her mouth. She raised a trembling hand and knocked. The sound was small, swallowed by the vast silence of the prairie. For a long moment, nothing happened. She wondered if he was even there. Perhaps she had come all this way for nothing. She was about to knock again when the door creaked open. The man who stood there was not what she had expected. The name on the contract, Jedediah Stone, had conjured an image of a hard-faced lender, a man with cold eyes and a cruel mouth. This man was tall and broad-shouldered, his face browned by the sun and etched with lines that spoke more of weather than of malice. His hair was the color of dried grass, and his eyes, a startlingly clear blue, held a look of quiet surprise. He wore simple denim trousers and a faded shirt, sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle. He looked at her, then at the small, worn bundle at her feet, and his gaze was not unkind. It was simply questioning. "Can I help you?" His voice was low and steady, like the rumble of distant thunder. Leanne bowed her head, her dark hair falling forward to hide her face. She could not meet his eyes. To do so would be to lose the last of her courage. She held out the paper. "I am Leanne," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Wife of Wei. I have come to settle his debt." Jedediah Stone did not take the paper. He looked from her bowed head to the document she offered as if it were a snake. A deep line appeared between his brows. "Wei," he repeated, the name sounding strange in his mouth. "He worked the railroad grade down by Willow Creek." It was not a question. "Yes," she confirmed. "He is gone now. The debt remains." She drew a steadying breath, forcing the next words out. The word she had dreaded for weeks. "I have no money. I have nothing. But the debt must be honored. I offer myself to work, to serve you until the sum is paid." The silence that followed was absolute. The wind whispered through the tall prairie grass, and a hawk cried out somewhere high above, but between the two of them, there was only a stunned stillness. Leanne kept her eyes fixed on the dusty toes of her thin shoes, her entire body braced for his response. She expected laughter, or a cold assessment, or a gruff acceptance. What she did not expect was the sound of tearing paper. Her head snapped up. Jedediah Stone had taken the contract from her unresisting fingers. With two swift, deliberate motions, he tore it in half, and then in half again. The first scraps of paper fluttered from his hand and danced on the breeze for a moment before settling in the dust by the porch step. "You owe me nothing," he said, his voice quiet but firm. Leanne stared at the torn pieces of her husband's shame, then back at the man's face. Confusion warred with a lifetime of ingrained duty. This was not possible. A debt was a sacred thing, a stain upon honor that could only be washed away with payment. To simply erase it was unthinkable. It was a trick. It had to be a different kind of cruelty, a way to unmoor her completely before revealing his true intentions. "But the contract," she stammered, pointing a trembling finger at the scraps. $112. "It's just paper," he said. He looked at her face, truly looked, and for the first time, he seemed to see past her formal words to the bone-deep exhaustion and terror that lay beneath. He saw the smudges of dust on her cheeks, the hollows beneath her eyes, the way her small frame seemed to tremble inside her dark, simple clothing. Wei was a good man. He shouldn't have been in that kind of debt in the first place. He stepped back, opening the door wider. "It's getting on toward evening. You've come a long way. You can stay the night. She flinched, taking a step back. No. I cannot accept charity. I came to pay. And I told you the debt is paid, he countered, his patience wearing thin, but not with her. It was a frustration with the whole rotten situation. Call it a night's lodging, then. You can't go back to town in the dark. It's a 2-hour ride, and there are wolves. You can have the spare room. You'll be safe here. He wasn't asking. He was stating a fact. The set of his jaw told her he would not be argued with. Trapped between her rigid code of honor and the undeniable reality of her situation, penniless, alone, and miles from anywhere, Leanne felt her resolve crumble. She gave a small, stiff nod. He bent down and picked up her bundle, his large, calloused hand dwarfing the small cloth-wrap package. He carried it inside as if it weighed nothing. Hesitantly, she followed him over the threshold. The cabin was one room, clean and spare. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth swept clean. A sturdy table with 2 chairs stood in the center. In one corner was a bed, neatly made. In the other, a small cot with a thin mattress and a folded blanket. That must be the spare room he meant. A door on the far wall presumably led outside to a wash area or storage. The air smelled of wood smoke, leather, and coffee. It was the scent of a life lived alone. He placed her bundle on the cot. The water basin is by the door. There's stew in the pot on the hearth. Help yourself when you're hungry. He didn't look at her as he spoke, busying himself with checking the latch on a wooden chest at the foot of his own bed. He seemed almost uncomfortable, as if her presence was a disruption he didn't know how to manage. She said nothing, only watched him, her mind racing. This man was an enigma. He had held power over her, the power of debt, and had simply thrown it away. Now he offered shelter and food with a gruff sort of kindness that was more bewildering than cruelty. She did not trust it. She could not afford to. Later, as darkness fell outside, she sat on the edge of the cot, listening. He moved about the cabin with a quiet efficiency, banking the fire, checking the door. The scrape of a chair, the clink of a tin cup, the soft sigh of a man settling down for the night. These were lonely sounds. She lay down, fully clothed, her hand clutching the one thing she had not included in her bundle, a small, smooth wooden bird, carved by her husband's hands. She held it tight, the familiar shape a small anchor in a sea of uncertainty. She lay awake for hours, listening to the strange new sounds of the ranch, the nicker of a horse in the corral, the creak of the cabin wall settling, and the steady, quiet breathing of the man in the bed across the room. He had torn up the contract, but she did not yet understand that the real debt was not hers, and its true owner was still out there. The morning light streamed through the cabin's single window, painting a dusty gold stripe across the wooden floor. Leanne was already awake. She had slept in fits, her mind refusing to rest. When she saw that Jedediah was still asleep, she rose quietly and went outside to the water pump. The cold shock of the water on her face was a welcome distraction. She washed, tidied her hair, and returned to find him stoking the fire. "There's coffee," he said, gesturing with his chin toward a pot sitting on the hearth. He didn't ask if she wanted any, he simply stated its existence. She poured a small amount into a tin cup, the bitterness of it a familiar taste. They ate a breakfast of biscuits and bacon in a silence that was thick with unspoken questions. Leanne felt like a ghost in his home, an unexpected guest who had overstayed a welcome she never received. Finally, he spoke, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "I have to go into Harmony Creek for supplies. You should come with me." Her first instinct was to refuse, to stay hidden in the relative safety of the isolated cabin. But then she considered her situation. She couldn't stay here forever. She needed to find work, a real way to support herself. Perhaps the town would offer a possibility. "All right," she agreed softly. He hitched a wagon, the movement sure and practiced. He helped her up onto the hard wooden seat, his hand briefly touching her elbow. The contact was brief and impersonal, but it sent a strange jolt through her. It was the first time a man had touched her with anything other than indifference or threat since Wei had died. The ride to Harmony Creek was long and bumpy. Jed drove the team with a steady hand, his eyes on the horizon. He pointed out landmarks, a lone butte shaped like a fist, a dry creek bed where flash flood sometimes ran, the distant smudge of smoke that marked the railroad line. He spoke of the land with a deep, abiding familiarity. Harmony Creek wasn't much of a town. It was a single dusty street lined with a dozen or so false-fronted buildings, a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, and a land office. As their wagon rolled to a stop in front of the store, Leanne felt a familiar prickle of unease. People stopped what they were doing to stare. A woman sweeping a porch paused, broom in hand. Two men lounging outside the saloon fell silent, their eyes following her. It was the same look she had seen in every town since she had left the railroad camp, a mixture of curiosity, suspicion, and contempt. Jed seemed not to notice, or perhaps he chose to ignore it. He tethered the horses and turned to help her down. "We just need flour, salt, and some other things," he said, his voice low, meant for her alone. "Won't take long." But it was long enough. Inside the store, the air was thick with the smells of pickles, kerosene, and bolts of dry cloth. The store owner, a portly man with a sour expression, greeted Jed with a nod but let his gaze linger on Leanne with open disapproval. Jed placed his order, his voice even and calm, ignoring the charged atmosphere. As they waited for the owner to weigh out the flour, the batwing doors of the saloon across the street swung open. A man stepped out, blinking in the bright sunlight. He was dressed better than the other men, in a dark coat and a clean shirt, but there was something slick and unpleasant about him. His eyes scanned the street and landed on Jed's wagon, then on the figures inside the store. A slow smile spread across his face, a smile that did not reach his cold, calculating eyes. He crossed the street, his boots kicking up little puffs of dust. He pushed his way into the store, bringing the smell of whiskey and cheap cigars with him. "Well now, Stone," the man said, his voice smooth as oiled leather. "I didn't figure you for the type to be out shopping with company." Jed turned slowly. His body seemed to grow larger, his shoulders squaring as he placed himself slightly in front of Leanne. "Croft," he said, his voice flat and devoid of welcome. Silas Croft's gaze slid past Jed to fix on Leanne. He looked her up and down as if she were a horse he was considering buying. "I see you've collected on my old account," he said, his smile widening. "A bit more than the paper was worth, I'd say." Wei always did have good taste, for a laborer. The casual possessiveness in his tone made Leanne's blood run cold. This was him. This was the man who had trapped her husband. Jed took a step forward, a silent, menacing movement. "She's under my protection," he said, his voice a low growl. "This is my business. Not yours." Croft held up his hands in mock surrender. "No need to get heated. I was just admiring your good fortune. You got a good deal. I sold that debt to you for a song, thinking it was a lost cause." He winked, a vile, conspiratorial gesture. "Clearly, you knew something I didn't." The store owner watched, wide-eyed. The tension in the small store was a physical thing, thick and suffocating. Leanne felt trapped, a specimen pinned under the gazes of these three men. "Our business is concluded, Croft," Jed said, his jaw tight. "Now get out of my way." He paid the store owner, his movements clipped and angry. He gathered the sacks of supplies, never turning his back completely on Croft. He guided Leanne out of the store and back to the wagon. As he helped her up, Croft's voice followed them. "You take care of that one, Stone. Good property is hard to come by." Jed's hands clenched into fists on the reins, but he said nothing. He slapped the leather against the horses' backs, and the wagon lurched forward, leaving Silas Croft standing in the street, still smiling that predatory smile. The ride back to the ranch was silent, but it was a different silence than before. It was no longer just awkward, it was heavy with a new, visible threat. Jed now understood that Croft was not just a memory from Wei's past. He was a clear and present danger to the woman sitting beside him. And she was beginning to understand that the torn pieces of paper back at the cabin had not been the end of the story. They were merely the beginning of a different, more dangerous chapter. That night, the sky turned a bruised purple, and a summer storm rolled in across the plains. Wind rattled the cabin's lone window, and rain began to fall in heavy, drumming sheets. The world outside dissolved into a roar of wind and water, shrinking their universe to the four walls of the small, warm room. The storm seemed to mirror the turmoil inside Leanne, a physical manifestation of the fear and confusion that had been building since her arrival. Jed built up the fire, the flames casting dancing shadows on the walls. The shared danger, the forced intimacy of being trapped by the weather, seemed to break down the barrier of silence that had stood between them. He turned from the hearth, his face serious in the firelight. "We need to talk," he said. "About Croft. About the debt." Leanne sat on her cot, her hands clenched in her lap. She nodded, her throat too tight for words. "I never lent your husband money," Jed began, his voice low and earnest. He pulled one of the chairs from the table and sat, leaning forward with his forearms on his knees. He looked directly at her, his blue eyes holding hers. "I knew Wei from the railroad camp. We weren't friends, not really. But I respected him. He worked hard, kept to himself. But I saw what Croft was doing." He paused, gathering his thoughts. Croft was a foreman. He preyed on the men who didn't speak much English, the ones who were alone. He'd lend them money for a doctor, or to send back home, but at rates no man could ever repay. He trapped them. Wei got caught in that trap. He borrowed money when his brother fell ill back home. Croft owned him after that. Leanne listened, her heart aching with a grief she thought she had buried. She had known Wei was troubled, but he had never told her the details, too proud to admit the depth of his desperation. "I'm not a rich man," Jed continued, "but I had some cash saved. I hated what Croft was doing. It was a sickness in the camp. So I went to him. I offered to buy Wei's debt note. I paid him $20 for it. Not because I wanted to own the debt, but because I wanted to get Croft away from him. I wanted to tear the damned thing up in front of Wei and tell him he was free." A log in the fire popped, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. "But I never got the chance," Jed said, his voice rough with regret. "There was a rockslide at the grading site 2 days later. By the time I got back to the camp, Wei was gone. I held on to the note, not knowing what else to do. I never expected you." He finally looked away from her, staring into the flames. "When you showed up at my door, offering what you offered, I felt ashamed. Ashamed that this rotten piece of paper had brought you to such a desperate place." He stood and walked to the large wooden chest at the foot of his bed. He opened it, the hinges groaning softly. He rummaged inside for a moment before pulling something out. He came back and knelt before her, opening his palm. Lying there was a small, tarnished silver locket, shaped like a heart. "This was my wife's," he said quietly. "Her name was Mary. We had this ranch, this dream. She took a fever 5 years ago. It took her in 3 days. There was nothing the doctor could do." His voice was thick with old pain. "I know what it is to lose the person who is the center of your world. I would not bring that kind of pain to another's door for any amount of money." The revelation settled over Leanne, a profound and quiet truth. This man's gruffness wasn't hardness, it was a shield built around a core of old grief. His kindness wasn't a trick, it was the empathy of a man who understood loss. For the first time since she'd arrived, she believed him. Tears she hadn't realized she was holding back welled in her eyes. She reached into the pocket of her simple dress and pulled out the small wooden bird. She held it out to him on her own palm. "Wei made this for me," she whispered. He said it was a sparrow. "Because they are small, but they can fly anywhere." Jed looked at the delicate carving, then back at her face. He reached out, not to take the bird, but to gently close her fingers around it. His calloused fingers were warm against hers. It was a gesture of shared understanding, a quiet acknowledgement of the ghosts they both carried. The storm raged on outside, but inside the cabin, something had settled. The fear that had kept Leanne rigid and watchful began to soften, replaced by a fragile, tentative trust. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean. The air was cool and fresh. A sense of peace had settled over the cabin, but it was to be short-lived. As Jed was checking on the horses in the corral, he saw 3 riders approaching. He recognized the man in the lead instantly. It was Silas Croft. And he was not smiling. Croft reined in his horse just outside the fence line, his 2 companions flanking him. They were rough-looking men, the kind who hired their guns for a day's wage. "Stone!" Croft called out, his voice sharp and demanding. "We have business to finish." Jed walked slowly to the fence, his posture relaxed but his eyes alert. "I told you, Croft. Our business is done." "Not quite," Croft sneered. "You may have torn up your copy of the contract, but I kept mine. And it has a clause you might have overlooked. In the event of default or death, all property of the debtor transfers to the creditor." All property. His eyes flicked toward the cabin, leaving no doubt as to his meaning. "That woman is mine. I'm here to collect what I'm owed." Jed's hands gripped the top rail of the fence, his knuckles turning white. "She's not property. She's a free woman. You have no claim on her." "The law in this territory is what a man with a bigger purse says it is," Croft retorted. "And I have a signed contract. I'm taking her with me. You can try to stop me, but my friends here are feeling persuasive today." He nodded to the men beside him, who both shifted, their hands moving closer to the pistols on their hips. The threat was no longer about money or social standing. It had become primal. Jed was outnumbered, and Croft was a man who would not be denied twice. Inside the cabin, Leanne had heard the voices. She peered through the window, her heart seizing with ice-cold dread. She saw the men, the guns, the malignant look on Croft's face. She saw Jed, standing alone, a lone bastion between her and a fate worse than death. She knew then that she could not hide behind him. His protection had brought this danger to his door. She had to be part of the stand against it. Jed stood his ground, his mind racing. He was a rancher, not a gunslinger. Taking on 3 armed men was suicide. But letting them take Leanne was unthinkable. Croft, seeing his hesitation, swung down from his horse. "Don't be a fool, Stone. She's not worth dying for." He started toward the cabin door, one of his men moving to follow. But before he could take 2 steps, the cabin door swung open. Leanne stepped out onto the small porch. She was not crying. She was not screaming. In her hands, she held Jed's heavy, black cast-iron skillet, gripping its handle with both hands like a shield. Her face was pale, but her eyes burned with a cold fire. She looked directly at Silas Croft, her voice ringing out, clear and steady, her English more precise than he had ever heard from her. "My husband's debt is with the earth now," she declared. "You are a ghost, and you have no claim on the living." Croft stopped, momentarily taken aback by her defiance. He laughed, a short, ugly sound. "A little sparrow with a frying pan. What are you going to do? Cook me breakfast?" Leanne's expression did not change. She then spoke again, but this time, it was not in English. A string of sharp, cutting words in her native tongue sliced through the morning air. The language was alien to Croft, but it was not to his hired men. They had worked the railroad lines, the mines, the places where men from her country toiled and died. They recognized the cadence, the sharp, angry pitch. It was the sound of a curse, a deep and binding malediction wished upon a man and all his kin. One of the men shifted uneasily in his saddle, his eyes darting from Leanne to Croft. The other man's hand, which had been resting on his pistol, dropped away. They were hired for a fight, not to be on the receiving end of bad medicine from a wronged woman. Superstition was a powerful force on the frontier, often more powerful than a day's pay. In that single moment of hesitation, Jed acted. He didn't draw a gun. He vaulted over the corral fence and slammed his shoulder into the nearest man, who was still half distracted by Leanne's outburst. The man grunted, stumbling back into his own horse. The animal shied violently, its eyes rolling. As it reared, Jed's own horse, a well-trained cow pony named Buck, responded to the agitation. Buck pinned his ears and lunged toward the second man's mount, biting at its flank. It was chaos. Not a clean shootout, but a messy, frantic tangle of spooked horses, shouting men, and ranchers' grit. The second hired man was too busy trying to control his panicked horse to be a threat. Croft, seeing his hired muscle suddenly and completely undone, lost his nerve. He scrambled back onto his horse, casting one last look of pure hatred at Leanne on the porch. He yanked the reins, turned his horse, and galloped away without a backward glance. His two men, one nursing a bruised side and the other fighting his mount, wasted no time in following him, eager to be away from a place that had suddenly turned sour. Silence descended, broken only by the panting of the horses and the sound of Jed's heavy breathing. He stood in the middle of the corral, his fists still clenched, watching the riders disappear into a cloud of dust. Leanne remained on the porch, the heavy skillet still in her hands. Her arms were trembling, but her gaze was fixed on Jed. He turned and looked at her, at this small woman who had faced down 3 armed men with nothing but an iron pan and the force of her will. A slow smile touched his lips, a real smile that reached his eyes and crinkled the corners. She lowered the skillet, the weight of it suddenly immense. Something inside her, a knot of fear she had carried for months, finally loosened. She had not been rescued. She had stood with him. Together, they had driven the ghosts away. 6 months later, the first snows of winter were dusting the high peaks, but the valley where Jed's ranch lay was still caught in the golden light of autumn. The landscape had changed. Next to the weathered gray of Jed's cabin stood a small, sturdy new extension, built of fresh-cut pine that still smelled of sap. In front of it, a patch of earth had been turned and cultivated. It was a vegetable garden, now mostly dormant, but the neat rows and the carefully constructed fence to keep out deer spoke of a summer of diligent work. Leanne was in the garden, bundling the last of the dried herbs. Her movements were calm and sure. She wore a practical dress of blue calico, and her hair was tied back simply. The haunted, fearful look was gone from her eyes, replaced by a quiet confidence. A short distance away, Jed was mending a section of fence, his hammer blows a steady, rhythmic counterpoint to the quiet afternoon. He finished driving a nail, tested the post with his hand, and then straightened up, watching her. He had kept his word. A few months prior, he had taken her to the land office in the next county over, a place where no one knew her or Croft. As a widow, she had more legal standing than most women, and Jed had helped her file a homestead claim on the 80 acres adjacent to his own. The paperwork was signed, the claim marked. The land she stood on was hers. The cabin extension was on her side of the property line. Their partnership was a quiet fact, accepted by the land and, slowly, by the people in town. Word of the confrontation with Croft had spread, twisted and embellished as such stories always are. But the core of it remained. Jedediah Stone and the Chinese woman had stood together and sent Croft packing. Croft himself had left the territory not long after, his reputation as a predator somewhat diminished when his target started fighting back. The townsfolk of Harmony Creek still kept their distance, but the open hostility was gone, replaced by a grudging, curious respect. They were left alone. Jed walked over to the water barrel, filled a tin cup, and brought it to her. She took it with a small smile of thanks, her fingers brushing his. He looked at her garden, at the rich, dark soil she had tended all summer. "It's taking root," he said, his voice soft. She looked from the turned earth to the solid cabin, then to his face. She took a sip of water, the cool liquid a balm. "Good things grow in honest ground," she replied. It was a simple truth, earned through fear and courage, through loss and a shared, quiet strength. Here, on the edge of the vast Wyoming wilderness, 2 lonely souls had found not what they were looking for, but what they needed. They had found a place to plant a new life, together. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.